everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to Shit They Don't Tell You on Sunday, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Joining us this week for our very first episode is the wonderful, delightful Deacon Julie Stecker, who is the assistant to the Bishop for Youth and Family Ministry in the Delaware Maryland Synod and the Metro DC Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. She's just a local rock star in Maryland, so if you didn't know that already, that's just in general what you need to know about Julie. I'll say this too, it's Julie's fault that I'm here. That's always a fun little reminder, is that Julie was the one that convinced me to move to the East Coast for seminary. So as the rest is history.
That's great. I got you with a ski resort.
Yeah, you did. I mean, it worked. I mean, that's really all it took. So our seminary is the closest to skiing. All right, I'm in. Sold.
I'm so excited.
Yeah.
So.
Great. So Julie, today we are going to talk about the Sunday after Easter, the first Sunday of Easter, which the gospel verse is John 20:19 through 31. So everybody knows that this is the gospel lesson every single Sunday after Easter. You will hear it every single year. And for those of us who preach, it's usually a Sunday that a lot of preachers take off and have guest preachers. And so for people like myself and Julie, who do a lot of, I don't anymore, but did do a lot of guest preaching, I've preached this Sunday a lot over the last decade. I'm sure you have too. And I think
I hardly preach, and I think I've preached on this text 3 times.
See? Mm-hmm. Including at an ordination recently.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, well, I will go ahead and read it for us. John 20:19 through 31. When it was evening on the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. Jesus said to them, "Again, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. And so the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your fingers here and see my hands. Reach out your hands and put them in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. This is the gospel.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So one thing to note that, so in our teaser segment, if you haven't listened to it, I talked a bit about the Revised Common Lectionary and what that is, and that it's this 3-year cycle of readings that we do in churches. There's an Old Testament reading, a Psalm reading, a New Testament reading, and a Gospel reading. And that it is not reading the entire Bible in 3 years. It's very specific and thematic to go with the cycle, which is, and so this text is particularly always signed to the Sunday right after Easter from the Gospel of John. And so that 3-year cycle actually focuses on 3 of the 4 Gospels. 1 year is Mark, 1 year is Matthew, and 1 year is Luke. And these are the synoptic gospels. And the thing about them is they kind of all tell the same story, just a little bit differently, which is why we follow them. And then the Gospel of John is like way different. Like he went rogue. It's 90% of John is not in the other gospels at all. It's thought to be the last one written, and that John had the materials from the other gospels, right? Like he knew what they wrote and said, I'm going to write these things instead. And some things to note from that is there is no story of like baby Jesus. There's no childhood. There's no tempting in the wilderness. There's no transfiguration. There's no calling of the disciples and no parables. It just like John just like goes for it. But anyways, because it's so different, we only use it for like holidays, basically, is when we and other random times we'll hear the Gospel of John. But you won't actually hear the entire gospel read through one of the cycles.
Sounds like I'm not like the other gospel writers.
Yeah. Little hair flip, like I'm a special gospel.
Yeah. John, I'll be honest, John is not my favorite. Some people are like, they love John. I'm not one of them. I'm a Mark fan. Shout out to Mark.
You would be.
I would be. You should do one of those make a BuzzFeed quiz of like, which gospel writer is your aesthetic?
People get super like heated about it too.
Yeah, but you'll get John, you get that like 6-week bread narrative every third summer, and it's just like, oh man, I'm carved out from John.
One thing that we like see in our text for today that I struggle with a little bit of Gospel of John is the Jews. John is really, really big at calling out the Jews. And I don't know Greek well enough to butcher that specific word that's there. So I'm not going to do that. But just to say that in the other three Gospels, that word, the Jews, is used 16 times. And it's used 71 times in the Gospel of John. And just to note that, like, the way that this is always used, right? Like, it's characterizing them as bad or as evil. It's all about the things that the Jews are doing wrong or against Jesus. And so it's worth noting that this is where we get a lot of the anti-Semitic rhetoric that we have in Christianity that has survived to this day.
Yeah, and I think that's something for us, those of us who identify as Lutherans, is particularly important for us to pay attention to, because Luther was so anti-Semitic, and it's really important for us to not kind of bury that and pretend like it didn't happen. Like, several years ago, there was this like formal apology for Luther's writings about Jewish people. And that's great that we did the apology, but like we still have to do the work and still claim that because we can't quote Luther, for the things that we like and then pretend he didn't say these things. Can
I interrupt you really quick? That brings me to a good thing about kind of like the purpose of this podcast and the meaning of it is to claim the whole Bible in that same way. Like even the parts that are uncomfortable, like, yes, the Gospel of John is very poetic and super horrible about the Jews, right? Like it's both, and to claim that as both.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. And like, I think that gives whatever text we're working with, whether it's text from scripture or it's writings of, church foreparents, whatever. I think that like being able to critique them and look at all those gritty parts helps us like look at it as a whole and say, I can look at this in a different way. So I really like to use the Common English Bible when I'm able to. And again, as someone who doesn't preach super frequently, sometimes I like, I can do things. I can say, I'm going to read from this version because I'm like,
And it's like exotic when you do that in congregations. You're like, oh, it's a different version.
And this Bible isn't perfect. It's a newer translation done by a really good crew. My college Greek professor is on the translating crew, so I felt like I could, sign on there. But one of the translation decisions that they made is using Jewish authorities instead of the Jews. And that's actually something that I had first learned from a colleague of ours, Pastor Neil O'Farrell. who has always been really intentional about that language in our Bible study. I've appreciated that because it helps me put into focus like what we're actually talking about there. Maybe that's not what John would want us to think, or what certain translators would want us to think. But remembering that when we're talking about the Jews, we're actually talking about the people who were in power, and the people who had that power and used it to undermine Jesus's work and to crucify our Lord. And so sometimes I'm actually at the point now where when I read other translations and I see the Jews, like my brain automatically does, the Jewish authorities. And so sometimes that's helpful for me in just thinking about like, okay, who are we critiquing here? Instead of piling on generations of blame for Jesus's death onto all Jewish people.
Right.
So yeah, that's how the text sort of starts off with a bang, right? Getting right into it. And again, that's something I think we don't talk about enough in our churches because we want to pretend like we're not complicit in that anti-Semitism.
There's a really good, hang on, I'm gonna find it. It's in this book. It's in The Strength of Her Witness, which is Elizabeth Johnson is a Catholic theologian. She didn't write it, but she like edited it. I'm gonna find it. Here's one of them in here is actually it is written by a Jewish scholar that sort of challenges Christians like to be able to talk about and to be able to articulate Christian faith without being at the extent of the Jewish community.
Yeah.
I can't find it, but it's in here.
That can be like a mini-sode later.
Yeah. Oh, here it is. By Judith Plasko. Feminist Anti-Judaism and the Christian God. By Judith Plasko. That's a good article that really, I mean, and so it's just great to challenge Christians. And I think that that's a good thing for us to always think about. Like, can you articulate your faith without being at the expense of someone else?
Yep.
And I think that's an important thing to think about.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the first things that jumps out. And it's, I think that also one of the beauties of the lectionary is the ability to like do a little bit of talk a little bit about the context that the writer was coming from. And so I wish that we did a little bit more of that. We get to spend so much time in a particular gospel. I love when preachers keep connecting it back to like, well, and this is what this writer's context was about. And so I think that that's really important work for John, especially.
So tell us about John's context.
I'm terrible at this. When I was in seminary, in our Gospels class, we had to do a quiz on the first day of Gospels where you like, you had 4 options and you had to like figure out which attribute was for which gospel for this long list. And then we took the same quiz on the last day of class. And I was one of the proud few who got a lower score on the last day of class than the first day.
It's probably because you're just overthinking it, right? Like,
often, absolutely. Yeah. Overthinking everything. So I actually don't know enough about it. And again, I think if I were a more regular preacher, I think that that's something I'd probably try and dig into a little more, is like really parsing that out.
Yeah, I think it's good to, and I'm, also not an expert. My last semester, there was a class specifically about John, and I was like, oh man, I should have taken that, but I'd kind of like maxed out on Bible classes and had to do some of the more like practical classes to becoming a pastor kind of thing. So I didn't get to take it, but so the Gospel of John's like the last one that was written, and primarily not for a Jewish audience is the thought, especially based on how John clearly feels about the Jews. And that it's a person that also was sophisticated, so they're not actually thinking it was written by John, a simple fisherman, because it is written in like proper Greek. So it would have been an educated person who wrote this.
Yeah, like super weird construction. Mm-hmm. I remember that much from Greek in the Gospels.
It was also by someone who very clearly felt very good about themselves, always referring to themselves as the one Jesus loved, like the disciples and the one that Jesus loved. Just so you know, I was there too. Like, that's how I kind of read some of those.
do hair flip count in this podcast?
Hair flip again. Because of, according to every image of the Bible, they all had long hair, right? So they were just obviously hair flipping all the time.
Yeah, so this text, first, so I want to like call out this thing that I think a lot of us probably talked
Call it
about.
out, do it.
Last year, but after we've now been in a pandemic, panorama, Panera Bread for a year now, the verse 22, when Jesus breathes on them, I'm curious in 10 years, will I still have the same visceral reaction to that I have right now? Because I'm like, oh, he breathed on them. No, thank you. I'm not here for that.
Can I tell you something else about germs too? Like also just like one, reading the text for the upcoming week about the foot washing. And sorry, for those that don't know, we're recording like before Holy Week, because that's just, in a pastor's life, you have to plan ahead, or else like if someone dies, you're just behind. So you try to be ahead. That's the whole strategy, just so you know. Anyways, reading about like the foot washing and like, think like, oh my gosh, he's like touching them, right? Like that's nice, not cool.
Yeah.
I recently started watching the Vikings because it's all on Prime, and why not? I like historical shows. And there's one where they do this ceremony where they're getting ready to take a journey, and so there's something that they do in sort of like their brotherhood before they get on the boat is they take a bowl of water, and they each wash their face in it, and then like some snot. I don't even know what that. Can't even think of like hawk some snot in there, and then pass it to the next person, and every single one of them does it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, did they not know anything about germs? Like even pre-pandemic, I would have been like, what are you people doing?
That's horrifying.
Horrifying.
Be with me for the rest of my life now.
Yeah. This really does feel very pandemic-y. Like they're locked in a room, right? So like, what does it feel like to be locked inside of a room all the time? And then someone comes and breathes in your face. Yeah, that's really different pandemic times.
But I think also like, our awareness of breath and closeness. I think that also highlights like what an intimate practice is, and like between Jesus and the disciples too, of like he breathed on them, and like presumably no one thought that was super weird. And so like what's our modern day equivalent of a germ-free, like, breathing on someone, allowing ourselves to be breathed on? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I read that, and like I wonder if I'll ever stop having like a shiver when I read that.
It's just a weird thing in general. Like think about if you're like standing there and someone comes in and they're just like
yeah.
It's another one of those moments where sometimes the disciples have to be like, he's losing it, right? Like clearly his marbles are all the way gone. Like his body came back, but he left some marbles in the grave. No, can't say that.
Oh yeah. So that was, that's just those pandemic realities of thinking about things that we've always kind of just accepted, and how we think about them now. But my hot take on this gospel forever and for always is that Thomas gets a bad rap, and we like, oh God, we just like, I'm like trying to watch my words because I recognize I work with the young folks, and I want to have the appropriate language filters on, but also like we just like shit all over Thomas all the time. Like he's held up as this example of like,
it's in the name of the title of the podcast. So if someone's offended by that, they didn't even click on it to begin with, which for the record was the intention. Like just, we're going to talk about things that just got to own a little bit. They're not great.
Say the word that evokes the feeling that you're going for. So that gets it for me. But we just like, it's, it's an easy sermon to talk about Thomas doubting and saying, oh, poor Thomas, he didn't get it. He's the disciple who, I always sort of envision like all the disciples, like, whispering like, oh my God, look at Thomas. He's like, talking back to Jesus. But that's like not in the text. So I'm totally reading my own. how I would be if I were in that situation.
My thing that's always bothered me about it is the fact that like the other disciples have seen Jesus. Like
Exactly.
it doesn't even say explicitly that they were like super shocked, but I mean you get that language that like Mary went and told them and they clearly did not believe her, right? They're like, I don't know what that woman's talking about. Didn't believe her whatsoever. Sorry, Julie, you're gonna need to repeat that. I didn't hear you.
That's really what I want to talk about.
Do it. Let's bring it. Bring it.
Like, okay, listen, I also want to be able to believe without seeing. But like, frankly, all of us now, we have to believe without seeing, right? So like, that's just our context because we're never going to be able to put our hand in Jesus' side. Um, but I wish that like verse 18 was attached to this gospel reading because Mary Magdalene left and announced to the disciples, "I've seen the Lord." Then she told them what he said to her. Like that, there you go. She told you, and they're all still like, "Oh, I'm so afraid. What if what Jesus said doesn't come true?" Locked behind their doors, and then they see Jesus, and they're like, "Oh, Jesus did get resurrected." Well,
And touched him too, right? Like, and touched him. It wasn't until they actually touched Jesus that they believed it.
yep. I mean, so yeah, I just want to talk about believing women, and without without women, we have even like understood Easter, right? Women were the first preachers. So
Yeah, talk about that. That women, like Jesus chose, or the angels chose to come to them.
right, yeah, and right. So that gets a little lost, I think, in our Easter proclamation, which is fine because we can talk about all the incredible things that that the resurrection means, and all of that, and the fact, like, what about Jesus's life and ministry indicated to us that Jesus or the angels wouldn't appear to someone who like has no status, right? And still, women are in the Bible, like, they're often not named. And yeah, I mean, there's so much that we could go into about.
Well, I think what gets me about it is especially today, churches that still tote around that women can't preach and women can't do this and women can't whatever. And I'm like, where are you getting that from? Because it's not from Jesus. Jesus was actually quite the opposite in his revolutionary in how he acted and treated and gave women the dignity that most men of that time did not.
Right.
And again, like, what does it tell us about God? That like God didn't come to those guys, those idiots locked in a room. God came to the women who got up the next day after shit was bad. They got up, they went out, and they did the thing, right? Like they weren't hiding.
Right.
That's who God came to see.
Right.
All right.
And the irony that like a lot of those churches, denominations, whatever, that don't permit women to preach, don't believe in women preachers, which, then you always want to do the believe in women preachers. I've seen them. Is that there's this like this sort of pride in not conforming to society, right? And their idea that like, oh, we're so pious and we're so not like the culture around us, when like that distaste or that like casting aside of women's voices didn't come from Jesus, it came from society. Yep. And so I always, find that ironic and sad. You have to laugh about it sometimes or else you'll just cry.
It's why we do cool things like this, so that people hear two women doing their thing and knowing what's up.
Correct. I mean,
yeah. And you know what? And I want that to hopefully empower women out there that have maybe been told in their life that they're not allowed to speak up or they're not even allowed to read the Bible in church because that's the way they were raised growing up. And I bet you there's women out there, many of them, I hope some of them hear this podcast, that don't go to church anymore because of these things. Yep. And so to those women, I want you to know that like Jesus is on your side and that there is 100% a place for you in leadership and in Jesus's church. And that, some of us were blessed that no one ever stifled my voice. I think some people maybe wish they would have more, but that's not because I'm a woman. That's just because I talk too much. But yeah, that needs to be said.
Yeah. And I can't, so AJ knows this because of how I lured her to the East Coast with the promise of ski resort near seminary. But in a previous life, I worked in admissions at a seminary. And one of the most beautiful parts of that job was people, like, literally my job was to sit there and listen to people talk about how God called them. It was incredible, a huge gift to me. And I had countless conversations with women who were much older, coming into seminary for the first time, because it had taken them so long to get through the trauma of someone telling them when they were young, and they said, "Oh, I want to be a pastor," of someone telling them that they couldn't be. And that didn't magically change in 1970 when the what's now the ELCA started ordaining women, right? That wasn't it wasn't like we fixed it all. It happens even in
Yeah, and to explain that too, that like even for progressive as even our denomination is, like it still definitely has its flaws. Like we do have a presiding female bishop, and that is amazing. Yet there are still congregations that won't even interview women.
Yep. Yeah. And so hearing those women tell their stories about like the specific that they have these very specific memories of the times that they were told that they couldn't be a pastor, and the ways that they were given leadership in other ways, and people would praise them and how great they were, but that this particular piece of leadership was kept from them. Um, and and like the whole process of going through discernment, for them, unlocking this idea that like that wasn't biblical. There are certainly verses in the Bible that can be used to prop up anti-women in ministry, but there are verses in the Bible that can be interpreted to prop up pretty much anything. And so also like knowing that if that's your story, that you were told you can't be in leadership, there's plenty of biblical witness that actually you can. So
Yeah.
take that. Patriarchy.
Smash it.
Yeah.
Can I just say also, just continuing with the whole the disciples, like that Mary went and told them, go tell them. So she did, and they're like, and they didn't believe it. And so this is what comes into, I think, some pretty harmful and toxic theology around doubting and not being able to challenge or question anything. Even some people who heard about, oh, you're doing a podcast to talk about that. Like, is it okay to say those things? I'm like, listen, these are in our scriptures and we have to own it just as much. And also, I really think that our faith gets enhanced when we have the hard conversations and we say the tough things, and we own the parts that are doubting, right? Like, it's okay if you don't believe everything in the Nicene Creed. That's okay. Right. And some people don't like always realize that. And so I think that's an important thing to note.
The concept of believers' baptism, which I believe that any baptism that happens at any time is valid and celebrated by God. And the idea that you would have to have some answers before receiving the gift of baptism is incredibly troubling to me. Particularly because I was baptized as a baby, and I wonder if I ever would have gotten to the point where I had all the answers that I felt were necessary, or that the church felt were necessary for baptism, if that hadn't been the case. I don't love it. I think that it's not possible for so many different humans to have like one mind about anything. And so I think that any statement that like, yes, we all believe exactly this, it's probably missing the mark for some people. And I think that's pretty damaging.
Well, and recognizing that, like, all of those statements of faith, or whatever someone puts in front of you like that, I mean, it's all human written, right? It's all how we have interpreted, or whoever wrote it interprets what's happening in the Bible, right? And so that's a particular lens.
Well, like, and I think about the importance of, like, this is why I think community is so important. I have a friend who is a campus minister who told me this story, and I can't remember if it was something she had done in her campus ministry or if someone else had done it. And she was sharing the story, but they did this sort of activity in their campus ministry where they all stood up to say the Apostles' Creed, and students were invited to sit down at the points where they were struggling with that statement of faith, with that particular part. And the visual for it was that even when you were sitting, someone else was standing. And when you were standing, someone else was sitting. And so this idea that the things that we have questions and we have doubts about and that we're not quite sure about, that like someone else can hold it for us while we're not sure, and that we don't all have to be standing all the time for like the vibe to be true, right?
Right. And the idea that, like, we are a Christian community, right? So we carry parts of each other all the time, and especially when it's hard.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, I mean, that's the beauty of like doubt and of questioning. In the sermon that I preached at my friend John's ordination on this text, I had talked a little bit about in the before time, we had a middle school and high school youth event in Delaware, Maryland. And the theme for that year was, can I ask that? And so really the whole curriculum and the whole weekend was structured around like inviting young people to say, can I ask that? And the answer being yes, and inviting them to bring up all of their questions and all of the things that they just like kind of weren't sure about. And not for getting answers. Like we weren't there to provide answers. It wasn't like a stump the chump weekend. But it was, the whole point was to say the act of questioning is faithful. Yeah. And I had a parent come up to me, a parent of one of our high schoolers in the leadership development program, who said, you know, when I was growing up in church, I was taught that we weren't allowed to ask questions, and asking questions was a sign of weak faith. And my children have taught me how to have a stronger faith by asking questions, because they are so willing to ask questions. And so like that was that beautiful example of like a younger generation teaching something to an older generation, that, you know, I still kind of, that's one of my touchstones that I go back to when I think about this work that we're doing with young people. But you know, that sometimes the question, can I ask that, would be considered controversial.
Yeah. No, and I think that's important for our listeners to hear too, is that's one of the things that, like, that's kind of my goal with this. Like, ask the hard questions. It's okay. Because not only like can God handle it, but I think all of us, like, I know I get smarter and stronger and a little bit more deeper into my own faith when I ask those hard questions. And even just like wrestle with the hard things throughout history. Like, Christians have done some pretty terrible things throughout history, and to wrestle with that and what does that mean for our faith today, is pretty important. So I don't think it should all go on Thomas, you see, and maybe if you look at it in that aspect of asking the questions, right? Like maybe Thomas just set out for us this ability to have this deeper faith, in asking questions. Maybe the other disciples didn't ask enough questions; they just kept hiding.
They just kept asking the same question. What does this mean? And one of the things that I love about Thomas is like, one of the most important parts of like a Christology, of thinking about who Jesus was, is remembering that God sent us an embodied Savior. And the fact that Thomas actually touches Jesus's wounds is really important for me, as we think about like what does our theology look like lived out in our bodies. That like Jesus's body was that source of like learning and of faith and trust for Thomas. And I think that can teach us also things about like, you know, the things that are the scars that our bodies carry, can be witnesses, to understanding of faith, and can be really powerful in understanding how God works in the world, because God physically came to the world. And that's kind of gory. I don't want to think about putting my hand in somebody's side. But I think it really helps us understand the human aspect of Jesus. Jesus was fully human. Jesus was fully divine. And Thomas being able to touch that makes it feels like, when the space between heaven and earth feels really thin, that feels like one of those moments.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with that too. And definitely we don't do, I think, enough work in our articulating our theology about bodies, particularly, Jesus, that God, put on human flesh, and what that would have meant, that, that he felt pain, and, he felt joy and all those same things that we do.
Yeah, and when I think it's really important, and I don't know that we ever talk about this, and I also want to say that I'm not someone who experiences physical disability, and so I don't speak for the disability community. But what I've learned from some folks in the disability community who I've had the privilege to learn from is that it was really important that when Jesus was resurrected, his physical wounds weren't healed. Because there's so much toxic theology about like saying to people who have a disability or who are disabled, that, well, when you get to heaven, like Jesus will cure it, and there were all these, when Stephen Hawking died, which was really problematic because he wasn't a person of faith anyway. But people, made these images of like him, walking toward God, as though like his death caused the healing of his physical ailments on earth. And so for a lot of folks, it's really important that we have this witness, that Jesus was resurrected with his wounds, like they were part of who he was. And so that we don't just like take away people's disability when we think about what it means to live eternal life, what it means to be resurrected.
It's not like it never happened to him, and I think that that's the thing to recognize is he's resurrected, right? Like he's living, he's breathing again, he breathes on their faces, but he's got those wounds, right? Like this happened. It's not like he came back and it never happened.
Yeah, right. Which really goes like enhances that point of saying like the things that happen to us actually do matter. We can't just like wash them away with a really nice crafted statement of belief. We have to like actually engage with the things that we say we believe, because we don't live in a vacuum or bubble. We have actual things happen to us.
Is it Maya Angelou that said you're the sum of your experiences?
Well, I don't know, maybe.
I'll look that up later, to make sure I'm quoting it properly. Anyways, the sum of your experiences, right? And so this is also true for Jesus as well.
Oh, it's well, I mean, this is some Goodreads, so I generally trust Goodreads, but there's also like some user-generated content. But according to Goodreads, from Maya Angelou, you are the sum total of everything you've ever seen, heard, eaten, smelled, been told, forgot. It's all there. Everything influences each of us, and because of that, I try to make sure my experiences are positive.
Yeah, see? And the fact that like that applies to Jesus too, right? Like he is, when he is resurrected and the time he spends with them post-resurrection, he's different. He has been changed by that experience, by pain, by certainly by death. I would say I've never died yet, but I think that would change you for sure.
Yeah. And so Thomas does a really bold statement of belief of like full all in, my Lord and my God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, he's the first one to say that, to physically call Jesus God. So that actually, yes, you are correct. That is an important thing to note too there.
And so, it's that sometimes out of our deepest doubt can come deepest belief as well, or deepest like understanding. And I also think that when we doubt and when we question things, the act of questioning means that we are open to like some sort of understanding. We're at least seeking it in a surface way by even having the question, but I think we carry a lot of those questions within us. And then when we see the answers or the response that kind of feels right to us, we're saying, oh, I absolutely understand Jesus in a new way now. And I understand how God works in a different way. And so without doubt, we just sort of, take Jesus at face value and we say, oh, he said those nice things. And, Jesus said it, I believe it. End of story. I don't know about that. I don't know that I think it ends the story a little too prematurely. And like our goal as Christians is not ultimate enlightenment. Like we're not all just here trying to like do a very long quiz with, where we took one quiz at the beginning of the semester and one at the end, and we hope we did better by the end.
Yeah, that's important to recognize that like you can be a Bible wizard, but that doesn't mean that, your faith is any less or any more than someone who maybe has never even, actually sat down and read the Bible.
Right. Yeah, and there are so many ways to experience and understand faith. And again, I think that's where community comes back in, right? And looking at this passage, like Thomas didn't have the benefit of community when all the rest of the disciples saw Jesus, right? They had one another to sort of turn to and be like, did I actually see this? Is this guy for real? Did he just read on YouTube? So Thomas, like, not being a part of that community, that affected his understanding and his ability to believe. And so, I just want us to like be a little nicer about Thomas in general. I think we're getting there as a church culture.
Yeah. Listen, I can say out of, almost every single Sunday that I've preached on the Sunday right after Easter, that's always one of the first things that I say is like to remember that like don't put this all on Thomas. Right. No.
Yeah, that's my the first time I ever even considered this concept that like we shouldn't just bash Thomas was actually in seminary when my friend Daniel he was in his first year of seminary doing the teaching parish thing where you serve in a congregation. And as you noted, often the second Sunday of Easter is noted as Seminarian Sunday, because everyone who had a seminarian serving with them, the seminarians got to preach. And Daniel titled his sermon for that week, Believing Thomas. And I was like, what are you talking about? This is malarkey. And that's really affected me through the years of thinking of saying, the words that we use matter. And so the fact that we call him Doubting Thomas over and over again, that ingrains that in us and doesn't allow us to see, Thomas's really bold declaration of faith. And like you said, the first one to call him God.
Well, how about we wrap up there and, give everybody that good spot of recognizing, just don't put it all on Thomas. He is the first one to call him God. And that's pretty awesome. But thanks for joining us, and we will see/hear you. Not hear you. You will see/hear me and someone else next week. So stay tuned. You can find the podcast on Facebook at facebook.com/shit they don't tell you on Sunday. You can also find us on Spotify and Google Podcasts and a few other places, and on YouTube. Take care, everybody.